What's good, y'all? This is SA, and this is month 5 of my devlog series, Guardians of RPG. And over the last few months, we've developed some really good features that already sets this version apart from the previous ones. New player and NPC sprites, a better NPC tracking feature, a better UI, a better dialogue mechanic, a day and night cycle, tall grass and a wild encounter feature, and an actual map for the sprawling epic. These are all good changes, but if we're being real, none of these features are as important as the one I'm going to be talking about today, the battle system. So in part 1 of this video, I'm going over the mechanics of the battle system in relative detail, how it works, the changes, and what I did or plan to do to make those changes. So let's just jump into it. The old battle system was, okay, it was pretty mid, and to be fair, that was kind of by design. The previous versions of Guardians of RPG are what we in the community would like to call a minimum viable product, or MVP. Basically, I was just getting started in my Unity game development journey, and in order to stop myself from spending too much time trying to make the game perfect, I instead would spend that time distilling my game into its basic components and forcing myself to learn as much as Unity as I could within a 6-month time frame. And so while it did help a lot in learning about game development and forcing me to narrow my vision for Guardians of RPG, it did naturally leave a lot on the cutting room floor, a lot of which being battle related. Here's what I mean. Most of the moves I made were either pretty worthless or overpowered. Now, of course, if you're playing an RPG, the moves that you learn in the beginning of the game will eventually become obsolete the more powerful and complex your enemies become. But in my game, most moves that you learn even later into the MVP were simply not worth using for one simple reason. The moves weren't balanced at all. In the case of the swordsman class, there's a few moves that you learn in the game that are fairly decent when you're starting out. Moves like cut, dice, cross chop, slice, all pretty generic moves with very little fanfare. Actually, now that I'm reading these names out loud, some of these moves were also just way too generic as well. Like they were just different names for the same thing. But anyways, you would have these generic moves where the purpose was just to deal X amount of damage to a character. And then all of a sudden, your player would learn a move like air slash, which is still a pretty generic name, but it has a lot more going for it compared to the others. For one, air slash has a priority of 2, which means it's one of the few moves that allow you to go before regular moves. In addition to that, priority moves also have a chance to make the opponent flinch, which gets smaller and smaller the more times you use it. The logic behind it was that priority moves are meant to catch your opponent by surprise, being performed regardless of how fast the opponent is in comparison. But the more times you use it, the less likely they're going to be surprised by the technique. Regardless of the logic behind it, air slash was a move that did a pretty good chunk of damage, had priority, had the ability to make opponents flinch, and you learned the move at like level 15. Yeah, I don't know what I was thinking. But at least when it came to moves like air slash, you would run out of elixir points or EP for that move and be forced to use something else. The thing is, all of the other moves were pretty worthless in comparison. For example, there's a move called Buster, which has a base power that is less than cut, but in return, it reduces the defense of the opponent by 5%. If you don't see the problem with this right away, I'll tell you right now, it has to do with the 5% defense reduction. To put it in perspective, let's say your opponent has a defensive stat of 5. In my game, lowering the defense by 5% would be taking it down to 0.25, which would get rounded up to 1, leaving your opponent with a defense of 4. The debuff is already inconsequential in this scenario, but the higher level your opponents are, the higher their defense stat will be, which will make using a move like Buster even worse. So if you have moves that are completely worthless and moves that are completely overpowered, it's going to force people to play the game the exact same way, which is the opposite of what I want. I want people to have as much of a varied experience playing this game as possible because I personally really value the replayability that comes with RPGs and video games in general. So after doing some preliminary research on fighting moves and turn-based games, I decided to structure my moves in this way. Change number 1, moves with stat buffs and debuffs will no longer operate by percentages in a traditional sense, but instead by stages. Stages have a predetermined multiplier assigned to them that factor into a character's stats. There are about 13 stages ranging from 6 all the way to -6, and the progression between each stage strikes a balance between having a noticeable change without being overpowered. Change number 2, all priority moves are getting a damage nerf. There are 3 types of priority moves, each with their own levels of priority and flinch rate. The way it'll be set up is the higher the priority, the higher the flinch rate, but the lower the actual base attack will be. It should make these moves still viable to use, but now priority moves will no longer be the meta-defining playstyle since it's not overpowered and leaves room for counterplay. Change number 3, more status conditions are getting added to the game. When making the game, I think I implemented like 4 status conditions, and a lot of those conditions were locked behind moves that required you to be a really high level anyway, which means that most players wouldn't even get a chance to use them in the MVPs. And again, this is one of those things that made fighting in the game feel very linear because there just weren't that many good options or strategies you could use to play the game. So not only am I adding new moves, I'm also adding new status conditions to the game to encourage different ways to play. I first started by adding most of the typical status conditions that you see in Pokemon: burn, confusion, freeze, paralysis, poison, and sleep. And most of you pretty much know how those work already, but I also added a few more status conditions that are inspired from D&D. And these status conditions are blindness, a condition that halves the accuracy and evasion of the character; charm, this acts similarly to infatuation from Pokemon; deafen, a condition that cuts the character's evasion stat by 75%; exhaustion, which has a myriad of effects depending on which level of exhaustion a player is in, ranging from disadvantage on rolls to an automatic knockout; frighten, a condition that impacts your roll advantage state, which makes it harder to block attacks, perform crits, or escape battle; petrification, a condition that freezes you in place for a maximum of 3 rounds; and restrain, a condition that reduces the character speed to 0, making them always go last for a maximum of 2 rounds. I know some of these conditions seem really busted on paper, petrification, I'm looking at you, but I'm still in the process of testing them out, so they are still subject to change. Overall, I believe having these status conditions will help give the game a few more dimensions and actually challenge people when they're fighting different opponents. And lastly, change number 4, the elixir points mechanics are getting a rework. Elixir points worked in the same way as power points from Pokemon, in the sense that you had a maximum amount of times you could use a move before you no longer could do it anymore. The thing is, Elixir in my game is more akin to Chakra and Nen from Naruto and Hunter x Hunter respectively. Elixir is a life force that each character has that allows them to perform certain techniques based on their archetype. Each technique requires a certain amount of elixir points to use, and if you try to perform a technique without enough elixir, it comes at the expense of your HP. Oh yeah, and of course, your elixir points would recharge by a certain amount each round. And that's pretty much the bare bones of it. If you want to learn more about elixir, play the game when it comes out. Yeah. The reasoning behind changing this was because this is how it was always supposed to work. I just never had the time to actually make a good elixir point mechanic when I was working on my MVPs. But even more so, I think it's a nice way to balance out powerful moves in the game. By making them cost a lot of EP, it prevents the character from being able to spam the same technique over and over again, which means characters and the players will have to be a lot more strategic with how they play. By the way, if you're new here, I would appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel. EO Comics is independently run by, well, me, where I basically make things from video games, comic books, and even animations, and it would mean a lot if you could show your support by leaving a like, a comment, or even subscribing. Anyway, the moves I created were only one part of what made this game a little lacking, which brings me to the next thing I wanted to talk about, the actual battle system. Now see, the battle system in theory wasn't actually bad. It followed a pretty simple flow. It asks you what you want to do, arranges the order of characters based on their selections, and each character would perform their actions that they chose, repeating the cycle until all the enemies or allies are knocked out. And like I said, this wasn't bad. I mean, it was simple, but not bad. The problem lies in the fact that I was a pretty crappy coder, like full stop. I mean, the way a typical programmer works is when they uncover a problem, they come up with a solution, and then once that solution works, they iterate on the code so that it's dynamic, readable, but most importantly, it covers most, if not all, related edge cases. The thing is, when working on the battle system, and most of the game for that matter, my code could barely meet all 3 of these criteria. And this only caused even more problems that became even harder to debug as the development process went on. But I'm currently working on refactoring how I code the battle system by implementing the state design pattern. Essentially, the state design pattern is a way to restrict the behavior on an object depending on which state it's in inside of a finite state machine. And a finite state machine is just a computation machine that inhabits one state at a time through a series of triggers with a start and an end state. By having the code follow a state design pattern, I can organize my battle system through different states and more easily determine where my bugs are coming from. So, after deciding on using the state design pattern, I got to work converting my ideas for the new battle system into a finite state machine, and it looks like this. Let me show you how it works. The initialized state basically sets up everything for the battle system, from the backgrounds, the characters, the camera, etc. The option state is a state that allows you to choose one of several options after everything has been initialized, whether it's a move or technique, an item, or simply to just run. After choosing your options, you'll either go through two states, the roll for initiative state or the roll to run state. Rolling for initiative is a D&D mechanic that determines who gets to go first in battle regardless of speed or priority moves. This can only be done for like a maximum of 3 times. Roll to run is a state that takes your roll advantage into account when determining if you're able to escape the battle. Once these things are taken into account and the order of operations are placed, the battle system will then enter the character action state, which displays the character's actions. Next, the action effect state will display the effect of said character action. If a character is knocked out, it will enter the character KO state, and if a battle is over, it will enter the battle over state. There are a few more states that I want to include, but for now, these are the ones that I'm adding to make the game flow in a way that's easier for me to code while still remaining engaging. And that's all I got for you guys today. As usual, if there are any topics you guys wanted more information on, I've left some links in the description that help me get started on some of these features. There was a lot to cover for this devlog, and I tried to condense it to its bare bones as much as possible, but if you have any suggestions for these mechanics or if you have any questions about them, feel free to let me know in the comments. I do try to make sure I react or respond to every single one because, to be honest, there isn't a lot, so please comment. I do see them. And if you want to show your support, feel free to playtest the previous versions of Guardians of RPG and let me know what features you want to see added or improved. And with that being said, I'll see y'all later. Peace.